This is chapter 16, The Concrete Investigation of Constitution, which is taken from The Science of Qualitative Research, second edition by Martin J. Packer. It begins with a quote from I think a student of Packer's, named Lois Waquant. And Waquant says in 2005, this study asks, how is pugilistic intentionality? Pugilism is boxing. How is pugilistic intentionality, the aboutness of that particular form of skilled social action, practically constituted? What social ingredients enter into its manufacture? Through what pedagogical techniques is it transmitted and validated? And what can its social genesis, inculcation, and unfolding teach us about the logic of any practice, and thereby about the vexed nexus of body, mind, and society? This final chapter takes the next step, offering concrete advice about how to design and conduct the kind of research that I have recommended in the preceding chapters. Like the instructions given to Eduardo Kohn, my advice may at first seem opaque. Certainly, it is not separable from the preceding chapters. It represents suggestions for how to put into practice the abstract considerations of those chapters. These suggestions cannot be successfully applied without familiarity with those considerations. By the way, despite saying this, I am, of course, providing this chapter separate from the preceding chapters of this book, because I believe it actually can be applied, at least to some end that is fruitful for us in our study or pursuit of research and how it impacts our writing. I shall use as an illustration of the techne of this kind of research the investigation by Lois Waquant that I have already mentioned. Waquant's research into the world of professional boxing, centered on a gymnasium in Chicago's South Side, offers an example of one way to align the components of qualitative research as a scientific study of the constitution of human beings, how human beings are put together, so to speak. It is important to reiterate that qualitative research is interpretation through and through. It is not a romantic hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study and performance of interpretation. Romantic would be getting to the real. So it is not a romantic hermeneutics that tries to penetrate to a hidden truth, but it is the kind of hermeneutics that operates on the surface of phenomena, articulating what is not usually noticed because it has been taken for granted. We saw in Chapter 8 that interpretation is always organized by a forestructure. In any research project, we will need one to gain access to the phenomenon you wish to study in its involvement within a whole situation. That's the forehaving. You will have two, a question that arises from an interest, and this provides a perspective from which to engage the phenomenon and understand it, your foresight. You will also have three, preconceptions that provide an interpretive framework, your foregrasp. So one way to think about these is, again, there's the situation, there's the the realm, there's your instrument, and then what he's talking about here is in this essence your inventory, but at the same time some kind of question that might open up beyond the inventory. That'll have to come from the vision that you're exercising and pursuing in your research. So you will also have three preconceptions that provide an interpretive framework, your foregrasp. These constituents of the forestructure organize for the understanding you obtain through practical involvement with the phenomenon. The character of this practical involvement takes different forms in ethnographic fieldwork, in the study of ontological work, and in interviews. The possibilities of understanding become evident when 5. There is breakdown of some kind. Such ruptures prompt circumspection. Think circumspection is sort of like looking around. Your understanding becomes clearer and more definite and assumes the form of 6, making a claim, stating an assertion about the being of the phenomenon, what it is. This making explicit of something, some phenomenon, as something, is the product of interpretation. You articulate your understanding as an increasingly explicit interpretation. Interpretation, then, is 7, the formation, education, and cultivation of understanding. The working out, the articulation, spelling out, and making explicit of the possibilities that have been projected in understanding. Heidegger insisted that interpretation, understanding, does not become something different. In interpretation, understanding does not become something different, it becomes itself. Every interpretation is grounded in what has already been understood. In other words, every interpretation is grounded in your inventory and is an appropriation of what has been understood. As we learn from Ricoeur, as one articulates an interpretation and shares it with other people, it will be expanded and corrected. The hermeneutic circle is this process of interpretation organized by forehaving, foresight, and foregrasp, then returning to adjust and correct these in order to articulate how you understand more clearly, completely, and convincingly as you move between involved understanding and the circumspection that is provided by breakdown and rupture. A true interpretation is not one that corresponds to any independent reality. It is one that points out hitherto unnoticed aspects of the phenomenon that are relevant to the practical task of inquiry. The hermeneutic circle is also the dynamic relationship between each part and the whole, and between a text or text analog and its context. But qualitative investigation is also an ontological hermeneutics, a hermeneutics of the subject, an inquiry that recognizes the dynamic relationship between being and world, and between past, throne, and future projection. The understanding that someone obtains in practical involvement is also a way of being, an ontological complicity between one's being and the world. Think about the product, your written report. Before we discuss the details of the logic of this kind of inquiry and how to deploy its techniques, you need to consider what you expect the product to be. What exactly is a research report? We have learned that it cannot be a neutral, detached, and objective description. The pair reality description is just as problematic as the other dualisms which we have uncovered and from which we wish to escape. Many different descriptions of a single phenomenon are possible, although there are many ways to be inadequate with a description. There are also many ways to be right. There is no single correct description. Rather, you ought to consider the written report of your research as an intervention. As Latour put it, research always explores the way a social phenomenon has been assembled, and the report itself is a matter of reassembling it. He was pointing to the fact that a research report is itself a move in a game, sometimes the very same game that is being studied. Even when there seems a huge gap between there, where you did the research, and here, where you are reporting the research, that gap may be much smaller than you think, and it can be filled very quickly. The kind of impact you want to have has implications for all aspects of your research design. This may seem to be putting the cart before the horse, but we saw in Chapter 9 that writing is not simply the final step in a research project. It is the core. Recall, too, Habermas's point that there is no disinterested inquiry in the social sciences. The way we investigate and what we discover are shaped by interests and concerns, which Habermas called knowledge constitutive interests. By the way, we call that your inventory. Do you want to foster communication and understanding? Do you have an interest in identifying and try to change exploitation and unfairness? Recall, in addition, Latour's recommendation to write with diplomacy. A contemporary anthropologist has to learn to talk about her subjects of study to her subjects of study. In other words, this is an anthropologist who is not afraid of running the risk of diplomacy. She knows how difficult it is to learn to speak well to someone about something that really matters to that person. Latour identifies four aspects of diplomacy, of the art of speaking well. To describe networks in the net mode, at the risk of shocking practitioners who are not at all accustomed in modernism to speaking of themselves in this way. To verify with these same practitioners that everything one is saying about them is indeed exactly what they know about themselves, but only in practice. To explore the reasons for the gap between what the description reveals and the account provided by the actors, using the concepts of network and preposition. To propose a different formulation of the link between practice and theory that would make it possible to close the gap between them and to redesign institutions that could harbor all the values to which the moderns hold, without crushing any one of them to the benefit of another. Your overall aim in your research project, then, is not a detached, correct description of a phenomenon. It is to have an effect, an impact on the people who read your work. At the least, your aim is to tell the story of the people you study, to make visible a form of life that has been neglected, or ignored, or misunderstood. Your report is an intervention, a reassembling, and an exercise in diplomacy, guided by a communicative or emancipatory interest.